make sure that we bring a working class revolution to the ballot box in the United States of America. Thank you. I love you back. Do you all like my haircut? It got a lot of attention last week. Damn. Thank you, New York City. Thank you, Queens. Thank you, Queensbridge. Let's acknowledge the ground that we are on, which is the point of zero. This is the ground zero for the fight for public housing and fully funded, dignified housing in the United States of America. Not only is this about public housing, this is a ground for environmental justice, because just beyond this park is a power plant that spills and spews off toxins to the poor, that shows exactly the fight of environmental justice that we are up against. But that's okay, because with the Green New Deal, we are going to center frontline communities, center working class communities, center communities of color, indigenous wisdom to transform our future, take it back, and preserve our planet. Last year, everyone's out, Green New Deal. Last February, I would tell everyone to turn around, but there's a lot in our way. But last February, I was working as a waitress in downtown Manhattan at a taqueria. I worked shoulder to shoulder with undocumented workers who often worked harder and hardest for the least amount of money. I was on my feet working 12-hour days with no structured breaks. I didn't have health care. I wasn't being paid a living wage. And I didn't think that I deserved any of those things. Because that is the script that we tell working people here and all over this country, that your inherent worth and value as a human being is dependent on an income that another person decided to underpay us. But what we're here to do is to turn around that very basic logic. It wasn't until I heard of a man by the name of Bernie Sanders that I began to question and assert and recognize my inherent value as a human being that deserves health care, housing, education, and a living wage. Now, I was born across this river in the Boogie Down. And like many first, second, and third generation Americans, I grew up between two worlds in multiple contexts. My mom was born in Puerto Rico. My dad was born in the South Bronx while the Bronx was burning. And again, let's listen to our history. My dad was born when the Bronx was burning, when landlords began to turn into arsonists because the insurance payouts were more valuable than the families that lived inside those buildings. Now, that was the backdrop by which my parents started their lives. And the backdrop upon which I started mine was in a one-bedroom apartment in Parkchester in the Bronx. They had a mattress on the floor and a crib in the closet, and that's how we started our American dream. Now, it was shortly after that my mom and my dad looked at the quality of education in the Bronx, and they looked at 50% dropout rates. They looked at the inequity of education, the inequity of education funding, the fact that teachers weren't paid, the fact that kids weren't given their tools to succeed, and that, frankly, it not only had to do with their income, but it had to do with their melanin too. And so my family made a really hard decision. And my whole family chipped in to buy a small house about 40 minutes north of here. And that's when I got my first taste of a country who allows their kids' destiny to be determined by the zip code that they are born in. And so much of my life was shuttled between these two worlds. And not just the two worlds between the Bronx and Westchester County, but the continental U.S., New York State, and the realities of Puerto Rico, where my family is too. And we saw the distinctions between these two worlds. I grew up where income inequality was an ingrained fact of life of my childhood. And it took everything in us to try to give that next generation a chance. When I was 18, my dad died of cancer. And all of the work that we did in a generation like that was wiped out. And I know that that story isn't just mine. It's all of our story. We are all always, it feels like just one accident away from everything falling apart. And we have to change the fundamental logic of a system and a politics that puts corporate profit ahead of all human and planetary costs. But when you rewind on that story, when I was a baby, my family relied on Planned Parenthood for prenatal care. Then Bernie Sanders fought for me. When I was growing up and education was being gutted for kids in the quote-unquote wrong zip code, Bernie Sanders fought for us. When I was a child that relied on CHIP so that I could see a doctor, Bernie Sanders fought for a single-payer health care system. When the federal government decided to discriminate and abandon my queer family and friends, Bernie Sanders was putting his career on the line for us. When I was a waitress and when it was time for me to graduate college with student debt, Bernie Sanders was one of the only ones that said no person should be graduating with life-crushing debt at the start of their lives. Bernie Sanders did not do these things because they were popular. And that's what we need to remember. He did this, and he fought for these aims and these ends when they came at the highest political cost in America. No one wanted to question this system. And in 2016, he fundamentally changed politics in America. We right now have one of the best democratic presidential primary fields in a generation. And much of that is thanks to the work that Bernie Sanders has done in his entire life. I'm in the United States Congress now. And that's a long, long way from being a sexually harassed waitress in downtown Manhattan 1 year ago. However, in this new historic freshman congressional class, an overwhelming amount of them now reject corporate PAC money. That's thanks to Bernie. An enormous amount of the House of Representatives endorse Medicare for all. That's thanks to Bernie. More people now than ever recognize the climate crisis as an existential threat, but also our greatest economic opportunity. And that's thanks not just to the climate work of Bernie Sanders, but the climate activists that are part of mass movement politics in the United States. Now that I'm on that other side, I can tell you the halls of Congress are no joke. It is no joke to stand up to corporate power and established interests. It is no joke. It's not just about standing up and saying these things, but behind closed doors, your arm is twisted, the vice pressure of political pressure gets put on you, and every trick in the book, psychological and otherwise, is used to get us to abandon the working class. And it has been in that experience over the last 9 months that I have grown to appreciate the enormous, consistent, and nonstop advocacy of Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, one thing I'll say is that it's not just what we're fighting for, but it's how we're going to do it. And how we're going to do it is with a mass mobilization of working class people at the ballot box. That's the only way that we are going to win this thing. Because one of our top priorities is not just defeating Donald Trump, but defeating the systems of which he is a symptom. That means that what we need to do in this country is organize a fundamentally positive and welcoming movement. One that is mindful, not only mindful of the ugly histories that created our present inequalities, the racism of housing segregation, the classism of the Hyde Amendment that tells us that low-income women shouldn't have access to health care. But we also recognize the imperialist and colonial histories that contribute to our endless wars and our immigration crisis. Not only do we need to recognize that NYCHA being underfunded by over $30 billion is not an accident, it is an outcome. It's not an accident, it is an outcome of a system that devalues the poor, that devalues working people, and that prioritizes buildings like those over buildings like these. And so, not only must we recognize what is broken, and that has resulted in why we're here, but we need to recognize the principles that will drive us forward. Because the logic that got us into this mess is not gonna get us out. So we need to build a mass movement in America centered on the working class, the poor, the middle class, one that is actively anti-racist, that is rooted in principles of universality. Everybody has a right to health care. Everybody has a right to an education. One that is rooted in principles of cooperation, that is participatory, that combats not only racism, but misogyny, anti-queer discrimination. We have to actively center those principles to drive us forward, because the future and our future is in public systems, and it's publicly owned systems, because we need to take power over our lives again. I don't know about you, but I don't want Mark Zuckerberg making decisions over my life. I don't know about you, but the Waltons have already been making decisions over our lives, and what we got was nothing. We need a United States that really, truly, and authentically is operated, owned, and decided by working and all people in the United States of America. That is what it is: multiracial, multi-gendered, multi-generational, and multi-geographic. We have to come together, not ignoring our differences, but listening to them, prioritizing them, understanding injustice, understanding that we operate in a context where slavery evolved into Jim Crow, evolved into a mass incarceration, evolved into the realities we have today. And so with that, I'm proud to say that the only reason that I had any hope in launching a long-shot campaign for Congress is because Bernie Sanders proved that you can run a grassroots campaign and win in an America where we almost thought it was impossible. And with that, I'd like to introduce the man, the ally. I call him Theo Bernie. Maybe to my goddaughter, he's Willow. Maybe to some others, he's brother. But he's my Theo Bernie Sanders.